our banks and corporates. This is to be attributed to the steadfast attention to ensuring macroeconomic stability, price stability, financial stability, and even policy stability, despite changes in government. Continuity in reforms momentum, adoption of global best frameworks tailored to our domestic needs and national priorities. It is the combined efforts of the governments, policymakers, regulators, regulated entities. All in all, despite odds, recent odds, the economy seems well settled into an equilibrium of resilient growth. This is quite a feat for a large emerging market and makes India stand out as an anchor of stability in a volatile world. Thank you. Jai Hind.
So in this kind of target in mind by the government, then obviously other part is the central bank independence and accountability. We know now central banks are increasingly, even our region, becoming more independent and also with a lot more accountability and transparency. So with this democratic accountability and independence, and also looking at the ambitious targets of the very high growth rates, especially in India, and obviously there may have some conflict between the central bank, may have short-term priorities in terms of stabilization versus medium to long-term growth. So I think, how do you see this kind of conflict, and how do you see going forward for the RBI? How do you see the address, or what are the things that in central bank mind to address if this is theirs, if I call it as conflict, or if it's not the conflict, but how you align with, especially with the transparent and accountable central bank with independence?
Yeah, this is an interesting question. India did grow, about 8% last 3-4 years. So in that sense, it gives us the confidence, to the finance.
So what are the things that in central bank mind is theirs, if I call it as conflict, or if it's not the conflict, but how you align with, especially with the transparent and accountable central bank with independence?
Yeah, this is an interesting question. India did grow, about 8% last 3-4 years. So in that sense, it gives us the confidence, to the finance. It's a series of unprecedented and overlapping global shocks. This reminds me of an old mariner's wisdom. You cannot control the storm, but you can certainly steer the ship. That's what the central bankers are meant for. This is the essence of modern central banking, navigating through turbulent waters with a steady hand, guided by the stars of stability, price stability, and financial stability. As some of you may recall, from the mid-1980s until 2007, it seemed that the central banks had virtually tamed the business cycles. Advanced economies enjoyed a long spell of low inflation and stable growth. The intellectual consensus that converged around frameworks like flexible inflation targeting. But the global financial crisis of 2008 and 2009 was a rude awakening, giving way to a period characterized by unprecedented global shocks and heightened uncertainty. It was a classic Minsky moment, a sudden, brutal collapse of asset prices after a very long period of prosperity but hidden debt accumulation. That crisis opened the door to an era defined by relentless series of shocks of diverse origins, from the financial sector crisis in the US, which exposed deep-seated fragilities in the global banking system, to the sovereign debt crisis in Europe, which threatened the very fabric of the monetary union, the taper tantrum episode of 2013, which sent shockwaves through emerging market economies like ours, and more recently, a drastic U-turn in the global trade policy environment, reversing decades of integration. The last 5 years in particular have been defined by overlapping supply-side shocks that have left significant scars on growth. From the COVID-19 pandemic and its after effects, the Russia-Ukraine war and its spillovers, and to the very frequent adverse weather events. These are not traditional demand-driven cyclical fluctuations that monetary policy was well equipped to handle. These were different, these were unprecedented, these were not something which one anticipated. These are complex, exogenous events that simultaneously dampened economic activity and fueled at the same time multi-decadal high inflation in many economies, presenting policymakers with a devil's choice. India too was not spared from their after effects. COVID pandemic resulted in India's real GDP contracting by about 5.8% in 2021. Subsequently, adverse weather effects and spillovers from the Russia-Ukraine war pushed headline inflation above the upper tolerance band of 6% in 4 quarters in 2022, all 4 quarters of 2022, first quarter of 23, driven by the sharp increases in the international commodity prices as well as the domestic food prices, which was accompanied with spillovers from food to core inflation. How did India deal with it? In situations where an adverse tail event materializes, the swiftness and the proactiveness of policy measures shape its efficacy and influences how fast an economy recovers. The flexibility embedded in India's, as we call it, the flexible inflation targeting, enabled it to focus on the growth recovery during the pandemic, even though inflation was rising, and then quickly shift gears to maintain price stability in the face of heightened price shocks that followed. Our mandate allowed us to look through some of the initial impact of the supply shocks while remaining vigilant against the anchoring of inflation expectations. A monetary policy response by the Reserve Bank to counter the devastating impact of COVID-19 pandemic was multifold, preemptive and decisive. First, it preemptively reduced its key policy repo rate to its lowest level ever in the 10-year history now of inflation targeting. Accompanying it was a slew of liquidity augmenting measures, again unprecedented, very timely, aimed at ensuring ample liquidity in the financial markets for all sectors and thereby prevent seizures and credit freezes that were occurring in the financial markets in many of the other economies due to the liquidity stress. Amidst the uncertainty, communication, the other pillar of monetary policy, and forward guidance became key elements to the Reserve Bank's monetary policy toolkit. The Reserve Bank's forward guidance was usually state contingent, looking to and linked to the evolving macroeconomic outlook, but the Reserve Bank blended it as needed with time-contingent guidance to reinforce the MPC's commitment to an accommodative stance. For example, uses of phrases like as long as necessary to revive growth and mitigate the impact of COVID-19. On the whole, the Reserve Bank approach was balanced and prudent. The liquidity injection was targeted with preset end dates, allowing for an automatic and non-disruptive unwinding as the economy recovered. By doing so, it avoided the pitfall of a liquidity trap, very difficult to get out. Once having injected liquidity, how to withdraw it, what's the time? Preset dates allowed the Reserve Bank to do this. Furthermore, at the same time, while liquidity was injected, the lending standards were not diluted in terms of the counterparties or the collateral requirements, which again is a crucial lesson from the past crises. By 2022, even as the economy was recovering from the pandemic, it was hit by the global spillovers of the war and the impact of various adverse climate-related events on the domestic agricultural production and food prices. As mentioned earlier, the targeted nature of our earlier monetary stimulus allowed for an orderly, automatic unwinding. I hope I am audible to everyone. I could hear some voices. Furthermore, fiscal policy also shifted gears to the path of consolidation as the economy progressively strengthened. These factors helped Reserve Bank to be relatively better prepared to face the sharp pickup in inflationary pressures in the year 2022. Monetary policy preemptively moved to a tightening phase, beginning with the change in the stance to withdrawal of accommodation in April 2022, followed by a front-loaded rate increases starting with an off-cycle hike in May 2022. Communication from the Reserve Bank reiterated initially the firm resolve to pull back headline inflation within the tolerance band, closer to the target, and thereafter to progressively align headline inflation to the target rate, and for a durable alignment of inflation with the target while supporting growth. This helped anchor medium-term expectations firmly to the target rate over time. A standout feature of anti-inflationary stance during this period was that of exemplary monetary fiscal coordination. As you are aware, 46% of the Indian CPI basket is food, mostly supply-driven, and over there the fiscal response, fiscal management becomes very important because monetary policy has limited impact on supply side. So fiscal response, therefore, was not just in terms of keeping aggregate demand counter-cyclical through its adherence to the fiscal consolidation path, but also of supply-side measures which sought to alleviate production or supply shortfalls and their impact on retail prices. Monetary policy, as I mentioned, would be ineffective to deal with the supply-side sources of inflation. Alongside these measures, monetary policy focused on limiting second-round effects of high food inflation on core inflation or underlying inflation trends. These monetary fiscal interactions help to balance the growth inflation considerations judiciously. A major issue that emerging market economies like India had to face during this period was the large fluctuations of capital flows, often triggered by advanced economy monetary policies. In this context, RBI actively pursued macroprudential policies to contain any domestic financial stability risks triggered by these flows. One of the key learning for the Reserve Bank from its crisis management policies was the importance of a well-laid out exit strategy from exceptional measures. This was also true for the supply-side interventions by the government, to know when to roll back the supply-side interventions, and similarly the demand-side interventions, so that as and when, they are reversed as the shocks wane out. In an age of uncertainty, the swiftness, nimbleness, and pragmatic approach of RBI's monetary policies has stood us in good stead. By 24-25, India is not only the fastest large economies growing in terms of growth, but also by February 2025, inflation was well within our target of 4%. Major financial collapses or recessions have been averted. Now, despite higher US import tariffs, trade restrictions, uncertainties going forward, global economy has stayed surprisingly resilient till now. Growth has been upbeat, defying projections, even though uncertainty has become a pervasive element of a contemporary discourse. Its tangible effects on real economy have thus far been muted. We have more to see as to how it unfolds. Global economy will, however, perform below its true potential for some time to come on the diverging growth trajectories across economies. Moreover, current trade policy environment and restrictions could damage, perhaps permanently, growth in some of the economies. Fiscally, almost every country today is quite stretched. It is not apparent how the situation could be normalized, especially if the world goes into a phase of lower economy growth. This is a risk for all of us, particularly when it is not accompanied by high inflation, though some of the large economies still have inflations above target, but it's not too high. Only some fiscal risks are being priced in by the bond markets, and equities' continued rise in bond issuance have steepened several bond yield curves in the advanced economies. While central banks in advanced economies are concerned about the elevated levels of public debt in their economies and worry about a disruptive resolution, full risks perhaps are not being priced in. This raises a specter of fiscal dominance, where monetary policy could become constrained by the need to ensure debt sustainability. Equity markets too seem to be a bit complacent, and I'm talking here about the global stocks generally. They have been particularly buoyant, led by technology stocks, leading to worries that a correction might be in the offing. In all likelihood, the tariffs, combined with large and stretched public debts almost everywhere in the world, will have some material impact on the respective economies and therefore on the global economy. As of now, it seems these risks are perhaps not being priced in the equity markets, and there is a greater tolerance too for inflation. While inflation is currently range-bound across most advanced countries, it is still running, as I mentioned earlier, somewhat higher than the targets. Policymakers are showing tolerance to it, with many central banks now in a gentle easing cycle as they witness some slowdown in the growth in economy. The US Fed, for example, cut rates in September, which could be seen more as preemptive, with unemployment in US still at a low level. All these raise the question whether the central banks will be able to protect the credibility of their frameworks if inflationary pressures remain persistent. Despite geopolitical tensions that would have sent oil prices soaring in an earlier decade, they have been very range-bound. This could be due to a decline in oil intensity of GDP, not just in India, but across the world. Perhaps gold prices now are showing the kind of movement that oil used to, that is acting as a barometer of global uncertainty. Overall, despite heightened uncertainty, global financial conditions now recently have eased. Near-time global financial stability risks have reduced or are not apparent at this time, and the banking sectors, fortunately, are very resilient in most of the countries in the world. Where does India stand in this era of turbulence and heightened uncertainty? India's macroeconomic fundamentals have remained very strong, built assiduously over the decades. We have strong forex reserves, low inflation since February, a narrow current account deficit, a very credible fiscal consolidation path, and very strong balance sheets of our banks and corporates. This is to be attributed to the steadfast attention to ensuring macroeconomic stability, price stability, financial stability, and even policy stability, despite changes in government. Continuity in reforms momentum, adoption of global best frameworks tailored to our domestic needs and national priorities. It is the combined efforts of the governments, policymakers, regulators, regulated entities. All in all, despite odds, recent odds, the economy seems well settled into an equilibrium of resilient growth. This is quite a feat for a large emerging market and makes India stand out as an anchor of stability in a volatile world. Thank you. Jai Hind.
So in this kind of target in mind by the government, then obviously other part is the central bank independence and accountability. We know now central banks are increasingly, even our region, becoming more independent and also with a lot more accountability and transparency. So with this democratic accountability and independence, and also looking at the ambitious targets of the very high growth rates, especially in India, and obviously there may have some conflict between the central bank, may have short-term priorities in terms of stabilization versus medium to long-term growth. So I think, how do you see this kind of conflict, and how do you see going forward for the RBI? How do you see the address, or what are the things that in central bank mind to address if this is theirs, if I call it as conflict, or if it's not the conflict, but how you align with, especially with the transparent and accountable central bank with independence?
Yeah, this is an interesting question. India did grow, about 8% last 3-4 years. So in that sense, it gives us the confidence, gives the confidence to the finance minister and to all of us that we can certainly, grow 7 to 8% long term. As you are all aware, the Reserve Bank has the primary mandate of price stability, but it is conditional, or at the same breath, it talks about keeping in mind growth. So while the primary focus certainly for us is growth, is price stability story, growth also is kept in mind by the Reserve Bank. Independence, this is a question which now has engaged the attention of the world, especially what is happening in some of the countries, advanced countries. And in India, we have a very unique